I wasn't looking for giants when I first encountered the photographs. I was cataloguing bridge construction images from the late 19th century, the kind municipal archives keep boxed and mislabeled, filed under routine headings like infrastructure surveys or river crossings. Most of them were predictable. Timber scaffolding, stone piers, rising in stages. Crews arranged in neat lines for the camera because long exposures demanded stillness. Then a few plates refused to settle into that pattern. The men standing beside the unfinished spans were not posed as attractions. They were caught mid-task, one hand resting against the block of limestone, another leaning on a tool whose head, to barely, reached his knee. Their clothing matched the period exactly. Heavy boots, rolled sleeves, suspenders darkened with dust. Two figures in the same frame stood at ordinary height, shoulders level with the lower edge of the stonework. The third rose above them by an amount that didn't feel theatrical. It felt logistical, as though the camera had simply recorded what was present and moved on. The bridges themselves were already immense. Arches climbed over ravines where riverbeds cut sharply through rock, their keystones perched higher than surrounding tree lines. In one image, the span cast a shadow long enough to swallow half the work site, yet the men beneath it did not appear dwarfed in the way scale models do. They fit not comfortably, not impressively, functionally. I checked for retouching marks. None. The grain held steady across faces and stone. Light struck cloth and mortar at the same angle. The proportions refused to warp. What unsettled me wasn't the size alone, it was the ordinariness. No captions flagged anomalies, no notes explained extraordinary laborers. The ledger entries listed only crew numbers and delivery schedules, as if nothing in the frame demanded special comment. I marked the folders and kept moving, but the sense lingered. Something in those photographs had already been seen once before and quietly filed away, waiting for someone to notice that the numbers no longer added up. The photographs were enough to unsettle me. The bridges themselves made that feeling difficult to ignore. I began tracing the sites back to their river crossings, comparing what the camera captured with what still stood today. Stone arches rose from watercourses that cut too deeply for ordinary scaffolding. Their foundations sunk into currents strong enough to tear away modern temporary works. Survey notes from the period recorded span lengths and pier widths in clipped, economical handwriting. But the numbers they listed refused to behave. Blocks weighing many tons appear to have been placed at angles that would require lifting power far beyond the cranes documented in municipal budgets of the time. Anchor points clung to cliff faces where no access roads were marked. Some sat halfway down ravines, as though construction crews had worked, suspended above water, with no trace of the infrastructure such an effort would demand. Even conservative measurements produced margins that strained at 19th century engineering manuals. What complicated matters was how ordinary the paperwork sounded. Routine appropriations, material deliveries, completion dates noted without ceremony. When I searched for explanations, I found only marginal comments in council minutes and brief engineering summaries that skipped over the most improbable features. Witnesses surfaced only as silhouettes in the archive, referenced through initials or titles, their remarks compressed into phrases like irregular labor conditions or atypical stone handling. Nothing overt, nothing followed up. It felt less like ignorance and more like something being trimmed down until it fit inside a narrower story than the structures themselves were willing to tell. The stonework raised technical questions. The paperwork raised human ones. Buried in municipal archives were fragments that didn't belong to engineering reports at all, court dockets that mentioned disturbances near river sites, hospital intake logs noting agitation, sleeplessness, repeated statements about construction crews that did not match payroll lists, town council minutes where unfamiliar remarks were compressed into administrative shorthand and then set aside. The language was careful. No dramatic accusations, no elaborate descriptions, just clipped phrases like persistent fixation, unreliable perception, unsuitable for further testimony. In one ledger, a margin note replaced several lines of transcription, as though whatever had been said was judged unworthy of the page. The individuals themselves remained indistinct, reduced to surnames and occupations: dock workers, survey assistants, local traders who happened to pass construction sites too often. Their words reached me only through filters, translated into institutional vocabulary, before I ever saw them. What struck me wasn't that officials disagreed with these accounts, it was how quickly the disagreement hardened into classification. There were no follow-up interviews, no site inspections attached to the complaints, no requests for measurements or corroboration. The process moved directly from report to resolution, bypassing the space where questions normally accumulate. It was there, in those click margins and administrative abbreviations, that curiosity began to tilt into something heavier. The bridges were no longer just improbable structures. They were surrounded by people whose observations had been processed, softened, and quietly removed from circulation. The files did not stop at classification. They progressed. In courthouse annexes and county registries, I began to see the same arc repeated in different handwriting. An initial remark, clogged without emphasis, a follow-up note indicating agitation, a referral, then a final administrative conclusion that required no further action. The phrasing shifted slightly from town to town, but the sequence remained intact, as if the paperwork itself had learned how to move these cases out of circulation. Medical ledgers offered similar patterns: short admissions, observations recorded in detached clinical language, references to fixation on construction sites, or exaggerated claims about laborers whose dimensions could not be substantiated. The margins grew crowded where the statements should have been expanded, crossed through with lines that replaced testimony with diagnosis. Court documents followed a quieter route. Petitions dismissed, complaints redirected, witnesses described as unreliable without explanation of what had been tested or verified. Clerks signed where transcripts should have continued. Magistrates noted procedural closure and turned the page. Across counties, across river valleys, across years, the same bureaucratic choreography unfolded. It was not a single decision made once. It was a system repeating itself until the people involved faded into footnotes and the structures they described remained untouched. By then, the unease had shifted. The bridges were no longer just improbable. The way dissent evaporated around them felt rehearsed. Once the individual cases were laid side by side, geography stopped offering comfort. I began plotting bridge sites on 19th century survey maps, tracing river systems that threaded through counties, separated by hundreds of miles. The patterns did not scatter, they clustered. Spans attributed to different contractors shared the same improbable pier geometry. Arches rose at matching ratios, their keystones positioned at heights that exceeded what local records suggested available. Equipment could reach transport manifests, listed stone shipments that, when converted into tonnage, failed to reconcile with the size of the blocks visible in surviving photographs. Survey sketches repeated angles as if copied from a single drafting hand, though the names at the bottom changed with each jurisdiction. In one county, wagons were noted as delivering prefabricated segments too large for the roads described. Elsewhere in the same ledger, in another, river depths were marked shallow enough to preclude heavy floating cranes. Yet the midstream pylons stood embedded in bedrock. The repetition did something quiet but decisive. What had felt like a string of curiosities hardened into alignment. Coincidence began to demand more accounting than coordination. What disturbed me most was not the reach of the pattern, but the silence surrounding it. No regional inquiries, no engineering conferences debating technique, no correspondence between municipalities asking how such work had been accomplished. Each district appeared to have solved the same impossible problem without ever acknowledging that its neighbors were facing it too. Suspicion gave way to recognition, and recognition carried weight. These bridges were not isolated achievements. They belonged to something broader, stitched together by rivers and records that refused to speak to one another. Recognition made absence louder. Once the bridges were aligned on paper, I began looking for the documents that should have surrounded them. Blueprints for arches of that span, load calculations, crane specifications, contractor correspondence arguing over stone quality or transport delays. Projects of that size leave paper trails as heavy as their foundations. These did not. Municipal archives preserved invoices for nails and rope, wages for ordinary crews, receipts for timber scaffolds that never appeared in photographs. What they did not preserve were drawings detailed enough to explain the geometry already locked into stone. Construction logs skipped weeks at a time. Contracts bore signatures from administrators but not from the engineers who would normally certify such work. Payroll sheets implied supervisory layers that never materialized in personnel rosters, lines of compensation without names attached. In several cases, entire folders were present but hollow, their contents reduced to inventory cards noting materials that could not be matched to any surviving plan. It was a mission, practiced with consistency rather than carelessness. The pattern shifted, the weight of the investigation. Structures that once felt improbable now felt inherited. Knowledge that should have circulated through draftsmen and site managers appeared to have evaporated before it could settle into record. What lingered was not just uncertainty, but the shape of something intentionally left unwritten. What followed the initial classifications was slower, quieter, and in many ways more durable. Census sheets from the following decades carried subtle alterations beside familiar names. Occupations replaced with vaguer categories. Residences shifted to institutions rather than homes. Marginal notes appeared where family sizes or employment histories should have continued uninterrupted. Small administrative deviations that accumulated into reputations no one seemed eager to question. In hospital registries, former complainants reappeared, not as witnesses, but as cases. The language no longer referenced bridges or construction sites. It referred instead to temperament, reliability, social function. Council records echoed the change. Individuals once described as dockhands or survey assistants were now indexed under headings that suggested instability without explanation. What unsettled me was the persistence. Years passed, bridges weathered floods and repairs. Municipal leadership turned over, yet the annotations remained, copied forward from ledger to ledger, as though an early judgment had hardened into a permanent descriptor. No document ever returned to the original claims. No later inquiry re-examined what had been said at riverbanks or work sites. The question of scale vanished, replaced by a quieter verdict about character. Silence, I began to realize, did not require erasing people. It only required redefining them until no one thought to listen again. The silence did not arrive gradually. In municipal bulletins published after the turn of the decade, the bridges remained fixtures of civic pride. Flood reports mentioned their endurance. Transport schedules routed traffic across them without hesitation. Maintenance budgets accounted for surface repairs and stone replacement. What disappeared were references to how they had been built in the first place. Earlier journals had included technical digressions, brief notes on quarry sources, passing remarks about temporary scaffolds. Those columns vanished. Engineering reviews shifted toward newer projects. Archival catalogs were reorganized, grouping the original construction files into collections labeled too broadly to be useful, their indexes truncated to dates and river names. Library accession logs showed odd breaks. Years in which survey reports should have been deposited simply ended. Replacements appeared decades later, summarized rather than reproduced, stripped of diagrams that older inventories insisted had once been attached. I began tracing the pattern across counties, the same narrowing of detail, the same pivot away from method toward monument. In some cases, annotations in archivists' hands admitted uncertainty about what had been removed, only that earlier references no longer corresponded to what remained on the shelves. No directive surfaced, no prohibition, only a coordinated thinning, as if explanation itself had been allowed to decay until the absence felt natural. What unsettled me was not that answers were missing. It was that the system appeared to have learned how to stop asking. By this point, the bridges no longer felt like achievements so much as inheritances. Maintenance reports treated them as stubborn facts of geography, obstacles to be preserved rather than systems to be understood. Crews replaced surface stones, reinforced joints, diverted water flow around aging piers. None of the procedures resembled initial construction. No attempt was made to reverse engineer the anchoring methods that sank so far below riverbeds. No modern assessment explained how blocks of that size had been lowered into currents without leaving evidence of scaffolding massive enough to match the task. What remained were improvisations layered onto something older. The same absence echoed through paperwork. Supervisors signed off on repairs without referencing original plans. Engineers annotated load tolerances using contemporary models, quietly ignoring the possibility that the underlying design followed a logic no longer in circulation. It was adaptation, masquerading as continuity. The pattern began to tighten. Missing builders, discredited witnesses, vanishing blueprints, reorganized archives. Now a century of custodial labor performed on structures whose origins had slipped beyond institutional memory. The realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived with the dull weight of systems functioning without comprehension, preserving forms whose purposes had outlived the knowledge that produced them. If these bridges were not fully ours, then what else in the landscape had been accepted on the same terms? I returned to the photographs with everything else now in mind. The figures beside unfinished spans no longer felt anomalous in isolation. They existed inside a lattice of missing blueprints, reorganized archives, censored reputations, inherited stonework, and decades of technical silence. What once looked like peculiar scale now sat inside a broader pattern of procedural retreat, a historical narrowing that seemed to move in the opposite direction of explanation. The witnesses followed the same trajectory. Their statements surfaced briefly, became administrative problems, then dissolved into reputational shadows. The bridges endured floods and modernization, while the circumstances of their creation thinned into abstractions. I tried to locate a single document that crossed those gaps, a ledger that named the designers, a report that preserved construction sequences, a technical diagram that accounted for anchors sunk beyond reach. None appeared. Instead, the archive offered fragments that refused to assemble, images without provenance, maintenance logs without origins, testimonies without hearings, structures that remained in use while the story of their making faded into administrative static. What persisted was not proof. It was the outline of something systematically unattended. Who built them? Why observers were neutralized rather than questioned? How monuments of such precision arrived without authorship? The records did not deny those questions. They simply never answered them, and the longer I sat with that absence, the more it felt like the most deliberate artifact of all.